Hitler once said of the Soviet Union, "We have only to kick in the front door and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down." His racial ideology, centered on the Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy that Jews, through Bolshevism, aimed to destroy Germany, meant that a total war against the Soviet Union was preordained. After Germany conquered France in June 1940, the OKH began preliminary plans against the Soviets. These were first defensive, with incorporated counter-offensives in case of an improbable Soviet attack. Hitler's 31st of July 1940 conference with senior generals was the watershed moment when operational evaluations against the Soviet Union became formal. The German High Command plans that became Operation Barbarossa were examples of the highest levels of hubris and self-deception. The objective was the destruction of most of the Red Army in Western Russia, specifically west of the western Dvina and Dnieper rivers, to prevent the Red Army from retreating into the Soviet Union's strategic depths. It was to be followed by an easy pursuit of the shattered remnants of the Red Army far to the east of Moscow. The Germans expected operational victories to cause the collapse of the Soviet Union. The principal foundation, Operation Entwurf Ost, had 4 phases and expected a campaign of 7 to 17 weeks, with the first 3 weeks deciding the campaign. The General Staff expected little resistance in the final phase, calling it the Railroad Advance. The OKH never questioned the ability of the Wehrmacht to achieve victory and concerned itself only with the best method of achieving that end. Scholar David Stahel wrote, "The General Staff demonstrated a wanton lack of professionalism, ignoring unfavorable intelligence and failing to consider in depth such critical questions as logistics, climate, and the imposing spaces, which extended not only the depth of operations, but, owing to the expanding funnel of the Soviet landmass, the breadth of the front line. Hitler, the High Command, and other senior commanders ignored, rationalized away, and deluded themselves that Operation Barbarossa was destined to succeed despite the overt critical flaws." For example, in November 1940, the Army Quartermaster General reported the Army had enough fuel for 435 to 497 miles for a campaign that called for roughly 870 miles and only had 20 days of foodstuffs and ammunition. A map exercise the following month showed that the Red Army would survive the initial onslaught and re-establish a defensive line at the Dnieper Upper Dvina rivers. In the 28th of January 1941 conference, the German chief of the War Economy and Armaments Department projected forces assigned to Barbarossa would only have 2 months of fuel stock. Other reports detailed additional shortages. The army would run out of replacements after September if the army did not call the 1922 generation early, a 30% deficit in trucks, and short 5,700 tons of rubber each month. The Germans also knew the Red Army's large size, but were confident in the Wehrmacht's superiority and Bewegungskrieg to quickly defeat Soviet forces. However, the General Staff was blind to the Soviet Union's mobilization capabilities. Despite all the estimates of severe logistical deficits and the Red Army's superior numbers, the German High Command expected a short, victorious war before it became a problem. When presented with these dire logistical reports, Hitler asked in early 1941 for economic-related answers, and the chief of the War Economy pulled a prepared report and met with General Feldmarschall Wilhelm Keitel, chief of OKW, in late January and early February. The report estimated the operation would cause aviation fuel to run out by the fall, rubber in April, and Barbarossa to run out of vehicle fuel after 2 months. Keitel responded, "The Führer would not allow himself to be influenced in his planning by such economic difficulties." Stahel assessed that the General Staff never briefed Hitler of these shortages. Keitel's reply also set the tone for further reports. Unfavorable details and reports were redrafted to be positive. 2 significant critical flaws in Operation Barbarossa concerned the German army's final objective and makeup. The German High Command wanted Moscow as the objective, but Hitler showed only marginal interest and focused on the destruction of the Red Army and economic objectives. Hitler's directive, number 21, issued on the 18th of December 1940, had Moscow as a secondary objective. They did not resolve their disagreement before Barbarossa launched, which directly led to the July-August 1941 crisis. The army's organization was also a significant problem in the expanses of Western Russia, as the German army consisted of two different forces, the infantry and motorized mechanized. Of the roughly 139 German divisions slotted for Barbarossa, there were 17 panzer and 14 motorized divisions. Over 77% of German forces were on foot. This split army meant the German offensive moved at two speeds, preventing the close mutual reliance of the two most basic arms of the army. The overwhelming part of the German army was not greatly more maneuverable than the Kaiser's army of 1914, or even that of Napoleon in 1812. Advancing panzer groups were islands in Western Russia's vastness, as their distance widened between their supply columns and the infantry. Without the infantry's mutual support, these panzer groups moved without securing territory, leaving strong enemy elements roaming to remain as a constant danger. It led to heavy losses. A natural question is why the Germans were arrogant, unprofessional, and ignored data and intelligence that Barbarossa was severely flawed. The answer comes down to two biases, historical and racial. The German historical bias stems from its experience in World War I and the Soviet Union's experiences in the years before Barbarossa. In World War I, Germany defeated the Russian Empire in 1917 while fighting a multi-front war, then lost against France the following year. Therefore, Germany saw Russia as weak and France as the most challenging opponent. When the Wehrmacht defeated France in roughly 7 weeks in May, June 1940, an opponent they failed to beat during World War I, they saw a war against the Soviet Union as no challenge. The Soviets did themselves no favors when Joseph Stalin's paranoia led to the Soviet purges, where over 57,000 Soviet armed force officers were sacked, eliminated, or imprisoned for supposed political crimes, gutting the Soviet forces of many of its best and brightest. The Red Army's lowly performance against an already overwhelmed Poland after the Soviets invaded on the 17th of September 1939, and its subsequent poor performance against Finland only encouraged German aggressive plans. The racial bias comes from Germany's belief in its racial and cultural superiority that Nazism heightened. They held the German race and culture superior to the Slavs. They believed Bolshevism was vastly inferior to National Socialism. Racially inferior Slavs ruled by even more inferior and incapable Jews. Both biases filled the Wehrmacht and Hitler with hubris that surpassed all professionalism, critical analysis, and morality. Operation Barbarossa remains the largest and most devastating war in history. In October 1941, Hitler confessed, "On the 22nd of June, a door opened before us, and we didn't know what was behind it. The heavy uncertainty took me by the throat." A German soldier would later write in his journal when he entered the war in the East, "Mother Russia opened her arms wide in embrace. Welcome to the war, welcome to hell on earth."